In his weekly letter, President Cyril Ramaphosa said focus discussions need to take place between government and trade unions to curb the rate at which public sector wages are growing. Basically, this was reiterating Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's budget speech last week. The president said the country is spending far more than it's earning and the government needs to make significant changes now. Meanwhile, the National Working Committee of the ANC met with its alliance partners yesterday following trade unions' outright rejection of government's intention to review a 2018 wage agreement. Government last week suggested a review of the agreement with trade unions, which would basically see public sector salaries increase by up to 7% in April this year. Remember, the unions have promised an absolute shutdown of the country if this does in fact go ahead. So, in studio with us to discuss this, we've got Labour Analyst Hassen Lorgat and Neil Coleman is a co-director at the Institute for Economic Justice, and he joins us via Skype. Gentlemen, it's great to have both of you here in studio to talk about this.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Hassen.
Morning,
Neil, welcome to you as well. All right, so a bit of a long introduction, but I think it required some background to all of this, and this all in a setting where government has entered into this agreement and it now wants to basically go back on it. Hassen, what do you think of this particular stance from government?
I think they're provoking a conflict with society at large, because by cutting the wages of workers, you're cutting services that many people need. And this austerity has never worked for people. It's never worked for poor people. It's an attack on poor people and workers. And I think that the government's inviting social conflict, and hopefully out of this whole discussion, and hopefully not a fight, the unions can get together and work as one, because someone needs to defend the working people against a severe political attack.
Yeah. All right, Neil, I'm going to ask you the same question. The stance from government towards the public sector wage bill, what do you think of this?
Well, thanks, Leah. And I think the first thing is that it smacks of a panic reaction. It not properly thought through. The collective bargaining agreement is a legal agreement which will be upheld by any court. And to the last day before the budget, to tell unions that you intend not to implement the third year of an agreement is really, as Hassen was saying, asking for massive conflict with public sector workers. And I think that resources are going to the right parts of the public service is a legitimate question, but then it needs to be tackled in a coherent and holistic way. And that is more of a medium-term process. We have a situation where resources are going into an unproductive bureaucracy in part of the public service. But then on the other hand, we have tens of thousands of vacancies in critical frontline services. So simply to slash across the board like that, as has been said, will severely compromise services. And the other cuts that have been spoken about, in addition to this 160 billion, already cut health services, education, policing, etc., by over 3% in some cases per person. So it really is not a thought-through strategy. And if anything, if there's any hope in this situation, is that this crisis which Treasury is provoking will lead to rethinking of the strategy, which is digging us into this hole.
Yeah. So, okay, apologies to viewers. I'm hoping that the connection will get a little bit better, but I think we got the gist of what Colin was trying to say. But, Neil. You know, in this, I beg your pardon, Neil, Colin, where am I getting Colin from? Neil. In terms of the amount that's going to be saved, I mean, we're talking, the Finance Minister wanted to cut this wage bill by 160 billion rand. What is the actual figure of the public sector wage bill? Do you have that on hand?
No, I think Neil would have it, but for me the issue is it's starting at the wrong point. I mean, the President and others were involved in drawing up these magnificent documents which spoke about democratizing South Africa through providing services to basic needs. Who does that? They're complaining that poor workers are getting services when everyone else is living it up. The CEO pay, there's a whole discussion that is not coming in. And he doesn't mention it in his talk.
Yeah.
The society is not, I mean, others are flaunting it and the poor are just managing to survive, giving out black tax, building communities of mutual support, but who you target are the victims of our new democracy. I mean, these guys are not the ones to be targeted. There are issues, as Neil talks about, that needs to be changed, and we have to work smarter, but clearly 1.3 million workers providing for a population of 55 million clearly is not exorbitant. So there are other interventions required.
Yeah.
But clearly this is not one of them.
And it's the will to implement
So
these
I
things.
don't want to go to the money is the problem. You know, money is a problem, but it's not the problem to this crisis. The people here have a need. And the president was involved here, talking about meeting the basic needs of people. They haven't done that.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, if we look at if we look at the situation that the economy is in right now, can we afford to have this wage bill? Something has to give. Yeah. What is it? I mean, Neil, let me come to you for that one. Do you have the numbers on hand? What is the public sector wage bill, the total of it? If we want to save 160 billion, what is the public sector wage bill currently?
Leanne, sorry, I don't have those figures in front of me, but there are various indicators that people use to look at what proportion of the population, what proportion of GDP, the proportion of taxation, etc., the wage bill is. And it is on the relatively high side if you compare it to other middle-income countries, if you look at it as a proportion of taxation, proportion of GDP. But our big problem in the last 10 to 15 years is that the GDP has been stagnating. You know, you were just talking in your headlines about the GDP figures that are going to come out from Stats SA. We are heading headlong towards a recession. Now, many of these ratios are with the GDP as a denominator. So if you say the debt to GDP ratio, it's a debt as a proportion of GDP, or public servants' wages as a proportion of GDP. So if GDP is going down, what it means is that all those ratios are going up. And therefore, we have a growth and development problem in our country. So instead of looking at the growth and development problem, we're trying to cut back in areas that are going to hurt us. Secondly, because of state capture, we are using public sector wages to finance the are now bailing out Eskom and other state-owned enterprises, whereas other proposals have been put on the table which avoid using the fiscus, such as using funds that exist in the economy, remarshalling and redirecting those funds without cutting back services. So the whole strategy has not been thought through properly.
Yeah. And you know, this is the reality. And I mean, also when you look at your basic public sector worker, as you say, they're struggling to survive on a daily basis. It's basically survival money that they're earning. But then you look at your CEOs, you look at the upper management, you look at your directors, and the bonuses. Even
members of parliament.
There you go. The bonuses that they're earning, the increases that they're getting, they're massive, these large annual increases.
There's a need
that needs to be looked at.
There's a need for a discussion about what is this new social compact, but austerity is not one of it because it attacks the poorest, you know. So that's ultimately the issue, and that's why I don't want to get involved with, they're talking about an ideological framework that says, well, the deficit is high compared to the GDP and the debt is there. But that is not our making. Our own objectives have been, how do we meet the basic needs of people, right? That is not featuring in the discussion. And I must tell you, all of them have tried austerity, whether it's Macron, everywhere else in the world, have had yellow jackets and others in the street. You know, the social crisis will be there. And the ANC and others who are proposing this will have to think twice whether they'll have any electoral political support.
Yeah. What President Ramaphosa said in his statement yesterday, in his weekly column that comes out, his newsletter, I beg your pardon, Neil, he went on to say that he doesn't want to cut the size of public service. That's not what he's saying. What he is trying to say and suggest is they manage the growth of the public sector. What in effect does that mean? I mean, we're not talking money here. What is he talking about?
So they're talking about bringing down the rate of growth of wage increases and also the benefits which public servants get. Again, this is a blunt instrument. You know, if you're talking about cutting the 19,000 public servants who are earning over R1 million a year, that's one kettle of fish. If you're talking about cutting nurses' wages and benefits, that's something else entirely. So you need to have a nuanced discussion about this. The second point is that, as we've said, there are tens of thousands of vacancies in the public service. So if you're hoping to cut the wage bill, you either cut back on wages and benefits and posts in the public service, but you certainly are unable to fill these critically needed posts which exist in various parts of the public service. So, Hassen talks about a social compact. There needs to be a broader social discussion in society. This is not a collective bargaining issue at the end of the day. This is an issue, a political issue about how we allocate resources, about who we value and what is important to our society. And unfortunately, this is going in entirely the wrong direction.
Yeah. Hassen, I know you want to comment.
Yeah, I mean, this year was a social compact endorsed by the ruling party, with a number of the political leaders from Communist Party and all that. We don't have this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. What they're putting in place is austerity to attack the poorest of the society, not the wealthiest, the poorest.
Yeah.
And that's why austerity will never work.
Yeah. And one of the biggest problems, and we know it, the unemployment rate in South Africa is not improving, it's getting worse. And you look at the sector of the population that's being affected, mostly it's the youth. With the unemployment levels sitting at where they are, and these plans that have been put in place to cut that bill down.
So this is the answer to the unemployment crisis, no?
Talk to me about that.
Well, how can it be the answer by putting more people on the street? People and public sector workers are in debt. Treasury a few years ago did a study on how many of our workers are living in debt. So debt is part of the crisis here of a nation, but they don't worry about the individual's death. You'll have suicides, you'll have resistance, and there will be different ways of people accommodate this crisis, but clearly resistance will be one of them. And I'm hoping, Neil, through this discussion, the unions can re-amalgamate, work together as one, so that the workers' voice can become much stronger. Otherwise, they will be picked off one by one.
Yeah, yeah. Neil, I mean, unemployment, the issue of inequality in South Africa, I mean, it is already... please correct me if I'm wrong, the most unequal society in the world.
Higher than Brazil now.
Exactly. It is the most unequal society in the world. By doing this, surely we're going to make that gap even bigger and the unemployment rate even bigger. Neil, talk to us about these numbers and figures that you look at on a daily basis.
Yes, well, I mean, there's no doubt that we have a huge crisis of unemployment and inequality in South Africa. We must remember that this is not just about individual positions of public servants, as important as that is. 25% of the economy is generated by public spending. So when the state takes 260 billion rand out of circulation through slashing spending, it also contracts the economy. It removes a stimulus to demand in the economy. And therefore, it is deepening the cycle of economic stagnation, which is why austerity has not worked anywhere. In Greece, when they implemented austerity, they destroyed 25% of GDP in that society, led to massive unemployment, etc. The Portuguese, on the other hand, did the opposite thing. Having been in austerity, they re-raised public sector wages, they raised the minimum wage, and of course the classical economists would predict, disaster, inflation, debt spiraling out of control. The situation 10 years later is that Portugal has got its debt under control. Greece's economy has been decimated, and Portugal is one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. So there is an alternative, and there needs to be a discussion about those alternatives.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk to those alternatives, and let me just tell you, I mean, we had the trade unions, we've had them here in studio, we've spoken to them quite a bit. Some of the suggestions that they've brought to the table, and perhaps we can analyse those and see if they work. They say scale down on some of the duplicated services by agencies, for instance, that are attached to departments like such as SASSA and Social Development, SANRAL and the Department of Transport. I mean, these are just two of the examples that they've given, but this is what they talk to. What do you think?
Well, even rationalizing how water resources are managed. They spread across many departments. It's ineffective. Poor communities don't get the adequate supply of water, and yet the president wants to grant water licenses within 3 months when people are mining without water licenses. So clearly, there's a need for this to work smarter, use technology, but 1.3 million people servicing a population so large is not huge. And as Neil points out, Portugal did the alternative, and a democratic government, progressive government, got elected. Austerity brings in the right, where we start putting ourselves against our neighbors. We're blaming them. We blame immigrants. This is what austerity does. You look for scapegoats, and we'll be fighting each other very soon.
Yeah. I need your comment on this as well, Neil. I mean, some of the duplication that the unions speak to and some of the suggestions they've said, as opposed to cutting that wage bill.
No, there's a strong case to be made for reorganizing and what's called right-sizing the public service, not in the sense of cutting back, but ensuring that the resources go to where they're really needed. So, for example, if you look at the police or the nurses or even the educators who are engaged in a lot of bureaucratic administrative work, they should be relieved of that work, and some of the bureaucracy and the administration should be redeployed to assist those frontline service workers, to free them up, to deliver the services in a much more efficient and effective way. So some sort of restructuring and repurposing of the public service would be very helpful. The Institute for Economic Justice put forward for the Job Summit in 2018 a proposal on reconfiguring the public service precisely to do this. And I think this is a discussion that hopefully the unions and government will enter into, but more broadly civil society, to say what sort of public we want, where should the resources be put. Of course, we can't demonize those purely at the top of the public service. Some of them also play important roles. So, for example, doctors, if you cut those who are in the top echelons of the public service, there is a danger that we chase them out of the public service into the private sector. So this is a matter that needs to be carefully managed and thought through.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, if you could read some of the comments that we're getting through, I'm going to read one or two of them to you. This is coming from Ujambase saying, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his ministers are sitting with huge salaries and benefits, but choose to take away food on the table of the working class. These leaders also enjoy dividends of apartheid-like farms, foundations, and businesses, but still paid high. But are still paid high. This is the sentiment of a lot of South Africans living out there.
Well, the Japanese in the old days, when something had to fall, the guys at the top used to cut themselves. So clearly, they have to show the example that they're going to be setting the example with the CEOs. We should bring in the private sector, who are living as if they are in another country. Yeah. This discussion needs to be a national one.
Yeah, it certainly does. Now, I want to ask your advice on this one, because trade unions have said that they have not been consulted. Big decisions like this are made, and this takes them by surprise. And when they do hear this, there's a major outcry. They're alliance partners, and this must speak to huge divisions that are happening there right now. What is going on?
I was in the unions as much as Neil was. I really think that the alliance must watch its step, because I think it's going to be beyond its sell-by date when they behave like this. You're taking other people for granted, and as I say, for me, the only hope out of this turmoil is for unions to regroup across political and ideological divides to defend their families and the society at large. Because when you cut services, when you cut wages, you're cutting services. One teacher teaches 30 kids. It's not 1 to 10. This is the change we still have to make. So it has to be labor intensive. A doctor that's earning over $1 million is not living in luxury. If he was in private sector, he would be driving a Mercedes-Benz in 3 months. Yeah. So clearly, the discussion must come right.
Yeah. Neil, just to talk about this threat from the public service and the public sector shutdown, if this does go ahead, what will that do to the economy of South Africa?
Well, I mean, that's a disaster. And, we would have thought that Treasury would think about that. I mean, they understand that, and the Minister of Public Service Administration spoke to the COSATU Central Executive Committee the day before, and apparently, according to reports, the proposal to renege on the agreement was not actually explained or put to the Central Executive Committee. So it just boggles the mind, the level of irresponsibility that is being shown here. There's an attempt to pacify the ratings agencies, to say we're moving boldly against the public service wage bill, but clearly we have a dysfunctional, sort of strategic leadership that is not thinking through these decisions and is being very short-term in their approach. So, in a way, what the only hope is that through generating this crisis, there's going to be, a situation where the policymakers are forced to engage on realistic alternatives, to begin to get the wheels of the economy moving, to raise the resources that we need. It's no great thing that taxes weren't increased at a time when we have a critical shortage of revenue. Of course, that was a populist measure by the Minister of Finance to say to people, look, we're not touching your taxes, or we're giving a relief to the middle income earners. But in the meantime, our corporations are simply not making the contribution that they need to make. The high income earners, the super rich, are not making the contribution that they need to make. And we need to rethink as a country how we get the resources which we need in order to deal with these critical problems you spoke about, unemployment and inequality and poverty.
We leave it there for this morning, gentlemen. We thank you so much for your time and for your insights into this vital issue in South Africa. Labour Analyst Hassen Lorgat here in our Johannesburg studio, and Neil Coleman, co-director at the Institute for Economic Justice, who was joining us via Skype. And of course now it's just gone 8 o'clock.